je mij ook uitnodigen.
Ja.
Meer kan ook nog.
Dit gaat als je met z'n tweeën oefent al een stuk beter. Maar dat zal niemand van jullie onbekend zijn. Het is ook het demo-effect. Ik hoor dan wel iets.
Hi, Perry.
Hey, how's it going? Let me just turn off my notifications here.
Can you hear us, Perry?
Yes, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfectly fine.
Perfect.
Okay. All right.
It's all yours.
Okay, so just kind of let me see, I got a couple of screens here. I can see everyone here. All right, so looks like there's like maybe 10 or 11 of you guys?
Yeah, somewhere around
closer.
Okay, cool. So, you guys, now this is the inaugural meetup, right? The first one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are you already all Ionic developers, or have you guys already done like introductions and stuff?
I think it's a different audience.
Yeah, it's varying between a lot of people. Some people are new, other people are going to demo their application.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, so as everyone here is a developer, though, probably at least a little bit familiar with things like Angular.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So a little while ago, Adam Bradley, our lead developer, has presented Ionic 2 at Angular Connect in London a few weeks ago. And so with Ionic 2, oh, there's like this weird echo. Sorry. With Ionic 2, I have to get these headphones off. There is a. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's much better. Yes, Adam unveiled Ionic 2, which is one of being really great, and but the way it was targeted is a little bit more towards. It was at Angular Connect, so it's targeted towards Angular developers. So what we've done at Ionic UK, and what I'm hoping to do here with you guys, is explain it more from people that are already interested in Ionic and into Ionic development, and already kind of familiar with the core, the basics of what hybrid development is and all that. Do you think that accurately describes this group? Okay. So if there aren't any questions or problems, I'll just go ahead and get started. Share my screen here. If I can. All right. I think I can see you guys and present here if I do this right. So yeah, just you guys can see that? Okay. So I can't see you guys anymore, but I can see this little chat window. So if you have any questions, just message me or something. or just unmute. But I will. We'll just get started. With Ionic, for those unfamiliar, Ionic is a way of using web technologies to build build cross-platform mobile apps. So it is a JavaScript framework, not unlike, or it is a JavaScript and CSS framework. So, and its core technology, or what language you're writing stuff, it's similar to things like maybe Twitter Bootstrap or something like that. But it's specifically targeted towards mobile devices, and even further, really targeted towards cross-platform hybrid devices. So what that means is you're using WebKit or whatever the browser rendering engine is that exists on all these different phones to power your mobile applications. It works out kind of nice because you can just use one language or one code base and distribute across multiple devices. It's very, very handy, and it's using technology that there's a lot more web developers out there than there are just like C++ or Objective-C developers or Java developers. It's much more universal language, so we're very excited about it. And another thing about it is that you can customize it. Using CSS is a pretty easy platform to customize, as opposed to like if you're using like Cocoa and like UI list view, for example. If you want to change the way your list looks and tweak that, that can be a little difficult. So it's using CSS. It's very, very easy to customize and tweak the display and the styling of everything. And we use Angular for our code structure. So we originally, when we were first creating Ionic, we thought we should use. We'll start with Angular because at the time that was kind of like it was. Angular was kind of the new hotness on the scene. Everyone was very excited about it, Angular, and but we had the idea like. So we'll build it on Angular, and then we'll also get Ionic to work with Backbone and Ember and all these other languages out there. And what we wound up finding is that Angular works really, really well with hybrid mobile development. It's the logical structure of how you build your apps in Angular translates very, very well towards mobile development. So we kind of went all in on Angular, and we have not looked back. It's worked out very well for us, and we're very excited about it. So it's been a fun and exciting year. Ionic V1 is now one of the top 40 open source projects based on GitHub's. We're judging that based on GitHub stars, which is for just being let's see, not quite 2 years old. That's very exciting. How fast that has happened. It's really, really exciting. There's a number of Ionic apps that are on Google Play Store and the iOS App Store, and there's tons of apps out there, but we've actually even seen some of them featured. So like when you first open up the App Store, and it shows you like the list of like what's the cool new apps that people are interested in. We're starting to see Ionic apps even there, and it's very exciting to see again like startups based around Ionic apps, and again now more enterprisey corporations are getting into it, and it's all because of this really amazing community that we've had. The amount of involvement in this project, the number of like meetup groups. So we got Ionic Netherlands. We have meetup groups. We just talked to Ionic UK. There's one in Ireland. There's something like 180 of them. There's an Ionic Kenya, which is kind of cool. So the community engagement, the number of people who log in every day to our forum or reply to GitHub posts, it's very exciting. So now Ionic V1 is awesome. It's worked. When it originally came out, there was a couple other technologies that there are things like if you're trying to use a SDK to build cross-platform mobile apps, the most popular option at the time was jQuery Mobile, which is okay for mobile websites, but when you're using them for mobile hybrid mobile apps that exist on the phone, it's just not the right tool. The performance is not there. It's kind of slow and laggy, and there was really a void. We saw a lot of people. I myself was building my own little mini frameworks or collections of reusable code that so that I wasn't having to completely rebuild apps every time, or rebuild like how navigation worked or what a button was. And there was a void, and Ionic stepped in and filled that void. It validated that that hybrid development can be performant, that it can work well, that you can save a lot of time and money by developing with hybrid. And that led to that massive adoption that we've seen. But a couple of other things when we did start, it was a long time ago. So iOS 6 was still the main iOS version that we had to target. Android 2.3 still had major market share that we had to support, which Android 2.3 is Android's made some very impressive improvements over the past few years. I'll put it that way. Getting hybrid apps to work well on Android 2.3 was a task in and of itself. So what we've seen in the past few years then is iOS 9 is out, and especially we've seen with iOS 8, there's been some substantial improvements in the software that powers these devices. So Android 4.4 was a major leap with the way that Android devices run hybrid web applications. So it was kind of a thing where Google realized that the Android team had been building their own web browser. Meanwhile, it's Google, so they have the Chrome team, which is building this really great web technology or web browser. And it took them until Android 4.4 to realize, well, maybe we should have the Chrome team help the Android team, and we should just package up Chrome and put it in Android as the default browser. And when that happened, the performance improvements that happened there were staggering. And so then now with Lollipop, it's gone even one step further to be what's called an evergreen browser, so that when you do just the regular minor updates on your phone, you're getting the up-to-date, most recent version of Chrome every time, which is fantastic. So where Android used to be kind of a bit of a problem with having up-to-date and modern browsers that we had to support, having now it's really leading the way. It's very exciting. We've also seen the phones are substantially better. I don't know if anyone still has like an iPhone. I think when Ionic first came out, there was still a lot of like iPhone 3GS or like original iPhone 4s were out. The performance differences between then and now on just the hardware itself is substantial as well. So this has led us to Ionic 2. So the differences between 1 and 2 at the Ionic level are not altogether that different. There are some substantial differences with the shift from Angular 1 to Angular 2. It's the same. A lot of the same concepts are there. The differences between Angular 1 and Angular 2 will take a little bit of getting used to, though. Don't let it scare you away. Once you play with it for a little while, you'll feel right at home. As far as for Ionic and all the Ionic components, like if you have like Ion List and Ion View and all that, those are still around. All the directives, the services that you would use, like Action Sheet, modals, and pop-ups, those are back, and they're working better than ever. We've implemented a number of things that we just found it difficult to implement that we didn't want to have too many breaking changes between minor versions of Ionic. And we've been able to implement a lot of those lessons learned over the past year, 2 years, into version 2, and that has led towards some really amazing performance improvements, as well as having just the Angular 2 itself has some substantial performance improvements. A lot of that comes from the way that we were able to, because we're not targeting those iOS 6 and Android 2.3, we're able to build things in a way that is using more modern APIs and is therefore a lot more performant. It's very exciting. So the goals with Ionic 2 is we want to keep it simple. We want to expand on this concept that we call platform continuity, which is the idea that you can use one code base that would, or that the code that you write, so if you use Ion List View, that it would look appropriate on iOS and Android, that it looks, so with Ionic 2, you have full material design support baked in. And the default components look appropriate to the platform that they run on. As always, performance is huge, and we're very, very happy with some of the performance gains that we've made. And then we want to get out of the way. We don't want to limit the way that you go about and style your app or build your app. There are some things in V1 where it can be a little bit tricky to maybe override some Ionic styles because of how classes inherit, and that we use classes a lot. So you might have to get a little heavy-handed and use IDs instead of classes, or you might have to use hopefully not like an important tag or something. So we've tried to get out of the way a little bit more, and then also really, really reinforce the idea that that you shouldn't have to code for specific platforms. Writing it once will work on Android and iOS. So yeah, if you're familiar with Ionic development, this is some of the code that you'll see, and this looks very familiar. So, but we've moved a little bit away from. You'll notice here there's not classes. Ionic version 1 used classes a lot. We've moved more towards just using raw elements and attributes. So you'll see, like, if to style a button, we just add danger instead of class danger. We've got the JavaScript is that's more of a thing with Angular 2 in general, is that it's getting a lot more low-level JavaScript rather than building a thing where you're injecting scope and you've got to create a module that is named and all this. Angular 2 works a lot more low-level, it's a lot closer to just plain vanilla JavaScript. So in Ionic 2, when you're building a new page, you're building just a class, and that class has some metadata attached to it through annotations that are going to be saying, like, stuff about where's the template file and stuff like that. But as far as the way that you interact with that page, it's just a plain vanilla class, which is very exciting. So yeah, here's an example of that. So here's a very, very simple page. So this profile page, you've got the class here, and then in the constructor where you're initializing all your variables, you just say this first name is Biff and the last name is Tannen. And that, in the same way that it gets output in Angular v1, you just use the double curly brackets to do first and last name. It gets output, and you're using Ion navbar and Ion title, the elements that you're familiar with version 1. And that's on the template URL that you're specifying through that metadata page. So, and here's another example of one where if you're trying to load up default pages, or if you're trying to do something like tabs or something like that, where you nest levels of pages. So going into a little bit more with that concept of platform continuity, with Ionic 1 we did things kind of in a weird order. We built out the iOS styles completely, and so we had the iOS version of Ionic pretty much done. And then we started moving into Android. And we took the approach of basically overriding the iOS styles to build the Android styles, and that introduced a few limitations. And in some cases excess code that we didn't really want. And we've taken a different approach where right from the start we're building an iOS styles alongside Android styles. And that's made for a much more streamlined and simple code base that we're excited about. And the differences are more than just style differences. You'll see, especially with our implementation of material design, there's some fundamental ways that the way that you interact with elements is changed and is platforms appropriate. Yeah, so it's not just visual changes anymore. So what I was getting an example of that here is this is on the right, or on the left is an iOS app, and on the right is that same exact code running on Android. So a couple things that you are familiar with from even V1 is you'll have things like the tabs are automatically on the top, and the way that buttons are styled is different, and the way that list items are styled is a little different. But going a little bit further, you'll see things like the buttons. We have the material design interaction going. We also have things like the, well, for example, these icons is something that we've expanded Ion icons. Click out of here. To have more items than the original Ion icons version 2 that Ionic version 1 ships with. So Ionic 2 ships with Ion icons version 3, if you can keep up with the version numbers. But what we added there is where you can see these different styles, where you've got the schedule, that icon here is the same. In your code, you're writing the same icon as just icon world. And that winds up looking different on different devices, and it's the way that icon should look on that device. So here you can just say icon home or mail or whatever, and depending on what device you're on, it's going to show you that platform appropriate icon. So here's an example, or some more examples of that. So you have like Ion home there, and on Android it's going to look more Android-y or Android specific. So yeah, we've expanded the number of icons in that library quite a bit to allow for that. So another thing we changed a little bit is V1. So in V1, navigation is coupled to the address bar. So as you navigate from page to page, you're going to see the address bar change, and that address bar change is under the hood what actually drives that that navigation from page to page. Is that if you update the address bar, it's going to change the app. All right, I saw a message. I'm gonna make sure it's okay. Make sure it's not from you guys. Nope. Actually, I should take a second. Do you guys have any questions so far? You guys can hear me okay? Okay, I think that's a yes. Okay. So with V1, the address bar drove the navigation, so that by changing that, it would go and say, it would look at that change and deduce what new page you should go to based on what that was. So we realized that that's really tying us into a web technology or web browser technology, or like traditional internet, where we're not really building those kind of apps. We're building applications that are more traditional, more like traditional mobile apps or platform apps, where there isn't an address bar, and that really shouldn't dictate how you navigate around. And one of the limitations that you saw in V1 is we didn't really expect this at first, but we've seen a number of issues where people will wind up doing some pretty crazy things where they'll have a side menu with tabs, and then inside there they'll have a modal that pops up, and that modal is going to have its own tab menu, and they'll start nesting these components in ways that are way beyond what we ever expected people would do. And getting that to work well with that sort of navigational structure just was difficult, if not impossible. So we've changed that in V2, where rather than having the URL is something that happens after the fact. You can choose to update your URL as you navigate around, or you don't have to. A lot of our current examples, the URL never changes at all. And the way that happens, so what drives your navigation then is this navigation array, or you can think of it as an array, this navigation class. And as you navigate from page to page, you simply just push onto that array, and you can wind up nesting those so that any one navigation array can have other navigation arrays. So like here you've got your main app navigation array, and then in tabs you've just got multiple child arrays. So you've got one for schedule, which has its own navigation array, and you've got speakers, which has its own navigation array. And as you navigate between those, they aren't tightly coupled to each other. And then so you can nest those as many times as you want, and it just works, which is kind of cool. And what this allows for is we've also are adding deep linking support. So you've seen things where if you want to, like for example in Twitter, if you from your app want to link over to Twitter app and pre-fill like a tweet or something like that, you would do in iOS, you do something like you create a link to like Twitter : / I think it's message, and then some parameters on there. This allows for you to support that in your own application as well, which is kind of cool. So we think that's going to be an increasingly popular way of using apps that interact with each other. So here's just some code examples. So to say, for example, navigate to a new page, you have this nav object that you've imported, and you just like any other element in an array, you just take that. So settings is another controller from that is another page somewhere else, and you just push onto that array that class, and by pushing onto that array, you are telling Ionic to navigate to that next page. If you want to go back, you just pop the array, and it'll automatically just send you back to the next page, which works out surprisingly well. We've been pretty happy with this change. So the next thing is customizability. So I mentioned that we moved away from classes. And a big part of that is the idea that we want to make it much easier for you to style your own apps. So and we want to we've kind of decoupled Ionic a little bit more away from the code side of Ionic from the themes and interactivity side of Ionic. They're almost, in many ways, separate code bases, so it makes it pretty easy to, if you want to do something completely from scratch, even go as far as that, is to add your own complete UI theme if you'd like to. We've moved it so Sass is enabled by default, where before it was an optional thing to use or not use. We've kind of gone all in on Sass. And the reason we've done that is, you remember in Ionic V1 we had these emotional colors. So you'd have like, you'd have something that, in addition to like primary, you'd have like royal and energetic. And it was up to you to define what these colors meant to you. And so you'd have those, I think it was 9 colors, and in your app, it was always going to have those 9 colors, and you could change what those 9 colors were, but you'd always have them. So in V2, we moved to using SAS maps. So you define in your CSS file colors, and you need to have primary. But other than primary, that can be your only one, or you can add any number of other colors that you use, however you want, and then you can name them however you want. If you have a brand called Super Awesome or something, whatever you come up with, you can use that name, and then you can use that name in your code. So if you're trying to style or color a button, and you create something here like Super Awesome, you would do button and then Super Awesome, and it would use that style. And that same approach is used throughout Ionic now, so that you can come up with your own terms that you want to use that make sense for you. The advantage of that is by using these SAS maps is that you're not adding unused styles to your application. You're keeping your CSS file or your output CSS file small, which is a huge advantage. Also, so another thing that has changed is version 1 animations. So we've got in Ionic V1 we did have some support for animations and tweaking, for example, the way that you navigate from page to page, but it was kind of famously difficult to work with. If you want to customize the way that page navigation works, you're going to run in the mix of CSS and JavaScript introduced a few problems and a fair number of gotchas along the way of trying to customize that process. So what we've done or what has happened in the meantime since V1 has come out is the WC3 has introduced this web animations API. So a lot of hybrid developers are familiar with the idea of if you want your animations to work well, to be performant, you're supposed to use CSS animations, because JavaScript animations are going to block the main thread. They're just going to be slow, and it's not going to work well. So with web animations, you get the best of both worlds. So one of the problems with CSS animations is they're not interruptible. You can't like step a CSS animation, or I mean you can step it, but you can't. It becomes increasingly difficult to say. If you click on a button, you say, when I click this button, I want this thing to go over here. But halfway through that animation, you click something else. If you want to interrupt or change that animation, there's not using just CSS animations. There's not really a way of doing that. So what we get with web animations is that you can modify those CSS properties in the way that you would with CSS animations, but you can control that animation with JavaScript. And that gives you, that's done in a way where it is performant. It's using the same rendering engine or the same GPU acceleration that you get with CSS animation. So it's really cool. And there's it's fully supported on Android, and the polyfill that works for iOS works really well as well. So what we've implemented that in V2, and that has made a pretty substantial difference. So probably the biggest thing that we had a bit of a headache with in version 1 is building out the swipe to go back feature. So if you do this slowly, you can see there's close to at least a dozen different properties that are changing as you swipe to go back, and that all has to happen concurrently or in sync with each other. So you see the main page slides in, or the parent page slides in, but it doesn't slide in from all the way over. Meanwhile, the main page slides completely from left to right. The nav items are sliding as well, but they're sliding in at a different rate. Meanwhile, the parent page is doing a crossfade, and the top navigation bars, all those items have their own crossfades that are happening at different rates. It's kind of a mess, and getting all those things to happen using CSS animations is complicated, and that was us building that animation. Never mind individual developers trying to build their own custom animations that have that same level of interactivity. So we've gone in and we've wrapped the Web Animations API to create a animation library that we're pretty excited about, to make it so that and we use it in our own animations, like this swipe to go back, but we've allowed it so that you can use it to create whatever animation you like, and it's very powerful, and we're very excited about it. So next up is configuration. So that was something that we've added to V1, but we've added the amount of configurability into V1 after the fact. So there's some things that are more configurable than others. In V2, we've made everything configurable from the start, and it can be configured at multiple levels. So you can say if you're trying to configure the way an app, if you're trying to turn off that platform continuity, so you want your iOS app to look like Android, you can do that now at the global level. So you can say my entire iOS app looks like Android. You can do it on a platform config, so say just iOS platforms look at this style. And you can do it down to specific attributes, so you can say in your markup, say use this config or use this value, down to specific instances. So that having that go down to, you could say like this tab bar looks like Android or something like that. And having that multiple levels, or every level across that logical stack of your app, being able to have control over how things look and behave is, oh yes. So I just see this question for Windows support. We have some Windows support. Right now, version 1 works mostly on Windows. There's a couple of well-documented bugs that are still outstanding. We have built it in a way that we can add, or that we are adding Windows support, or for version 2. Right now we're focusing primarily on iOS and Android, and that's just a decision based on market share. And as we get further along, we'll be adding more Windows support, especially if their market share increases. But yeah, we have done some testing on Windows devices already, and while the platform continuity isn't totally there, it works quite well on Windows at this point. All right, so JavaScript. So those I'm familiar with, or those who have been following the Angular 1 and 2 conversation, are probably familiar with the idea that Angular 2 has gone and it implements ES6, which ES6 is still being built out, or it's still being, support is still being added to the individual browsers, but it's not completely there. So this means that there is a build step in your Ionic apps now. So what it does is it takes you're writing ES6 code. So all those things that we saw with metadata, like annotations, well, that's TypeScript actually, but having ES6 like classes in JavaScript, that's an ES6 feature, and Ionic 2 and Angular 2 rely heavily on classes. And to get that to work in ES5, there is a build step now. And that works at that, well, some might view it as annoying. What it does add is our ability to substantially optimize your code, which is, say for example, if you don't use action sheets in your app at all, that eventual compiled code that gets output doesn't include the logic for action sheets at all, which is very exciting. And so the nice thing about that is this embrace of ES6 is it lets you use the direction that JavaScript is going today, which is very fun and exciting, and yeah, there's a lot of very there's a lot of blogs about the differences between ES5 and ES6. Personally, my belief is that it allows your code to be a lot more clean and structured and organized, and I'm very excited about it. So I mentioned TypeScript. So that metadata that I showed you, where it specifies the URL or the template URL of whatever page you're on, that metadata is decorators, is what those are called, and it's a way of adding information that Ionic and Angular need to know about your page to that class. Which compiler is used? So right now that's a very good question. We're in the process of maybe making some changes to that. So we use the TypeScript compiler for that conversion, and then we use Webpack to compress it all, or to package it all up. But we are considering using System as well, and we're considering making some changes to that. But currently, it's a combination of TypeScript's compiler and Webpack, and like Gulp to kind of organize everything. TypeScript, it introduces, in addition to decorators, which is what we primarily use, it also introduces types. So types doesn't do much to improve the performance of your app or anything, but what it does do is it helps your editors with things like code completion. So if you're familiar with like C# development, if you start typing in a class and you say class dot or something like that, it's going to immediately pull up all the things that class can do. And that auto-completion is possible because of the way that that language is typed. So now with TypeScript, it makes JavaScript optionally typed, which you don't have to do it in your own code. Most of our examples don't use types. We do use decorators heavily, but especially for if you're building a larger, more enterprise application, I would suggest using types just because it helps with larger teams, and it helps with the editors. So another thing is with V1 is say you've built this cool app and you want to access the file system or geolocation or something like that. Those are all done using Cordova plugins. Now we wound up seeing a need for simplifying that process, so we wound up creating this project called ng Cordova. And right now that's in V1, that's a separate project. That's a separate library that you use, and you import that into your Ionic application. And so what we've done is we've taken that a step further, and the libraries, we've taken those components of ng Cordova and added them into the Ionic core itself. So if you want to use the file system or access the battery meter or something like that, you do that. That code is already there, or that ng Cordova side of that plugin is already there and ready for you to use. All you have to do is add the Cordova plugin, and then you can start interacting with it right away. I mentioned that there's this build step now, and that build step comes with a substantially improved CLI. So the CLI will automatically handle all that build step. It's a pretty complicated process right now to get that build step set up and working well. So we have set up the Ionic, or we've expanded this Ionic CLI to handle all that compilation and transpiling and all that for you, as well as all the things that you're familiar with, like Sass compiling and building for Cordova. And also, for those, I guess it's an older feature by now, but still one that we should stress as often as possible. Crosswalk support is enabled. I think it's by default now, which substantially improves performance on older Android devices. Getting back to the larger end of things, or kind of retrospectively looking back on the community, the Ionic community is massive. So I mentioned that we have very active forum users. I think this number is 105 meetups. I think that's an old number. I think we've found quite a few more since then. But we've got this. I've been talking with Hank and and many other Ionic users on our Slack, Ionic Worldwide. So there's 3,000 people there, and while we don't collect many analytics, what we do know when people do the Ionic start command, and that happens 4,000 times every day, which is staggering. The number of people building apps in Ionic is just amazing. So it's very, very exciting. So if you want to get started, you can just go to ionic.io/2 right now and get started. It's still Ionic 1 is still the tool that you probably Max would probably yell at me for saying this, but Ionic 1 is still alive and kicking, and it's version 2 of Ionic is still alpha, and there's still bugs and quirks being worked out. So, but if you want to get started playing with it, definitely encourage you to go to ionic.io/2. And so what's next is, well, actually I forgot to update this. 2 weeks ago we released the alpha. We're talking about maybe adding web worker support to get multi-threading added, and we're going to be staying in sync with Angular 2, so as they release new features and as they release their versions, we're going to be updating in lockstep with them. So on ES6, so that's with the transpiling process. So the if you write your ES6 code, what the Ionic CLI will do is actually convert that code over to ES5 code. So while you're coding in ES6 and TypeScript, what actually gets deployed to your devices is ES5. So actually, yeah, this is a great time. I think that's the end of the presentation, yeah. So let's open it up for questions.
First of all,
let me switch to headphones here. Okay.
thanks a lot, Barry, for.
Let me. See, Hank, if you are able to mute your computer, I think that might work. Or turn off your volume as well. I think. Okay, there we go.
This is going to work, but we're going to have non-full duplex sound, but we'll probably do it this way.
Okay.
First of all, thank you very much for giving this presentation. Let's check if here are some. Let's check if there's some questions here for you.
Okay.
There's one question here about the state. How is the state saved?
How is the state saved? Are you meaning for things like live reloading during development, or in what reference do you mean state?
You say that you link it inside. Do you see what I'm saying? Because you can enter an app in the middle of the app.
Can you hear the question, Barry?
No, I can hear you though. Would you mind restating that?
Yeah, the question is, how do you remain state if you, for example, enter the app like mid-session? So what you explained via URL, how is that state saved and supported?
Right. So I mentioned that we moved away from URLs, and so that is an issue. What you can do, you can retroactively modify the URL, and what that allows is that ability to do. You can you can optionally let that drive your navigation. So if you come into your app to a specific URL, it's going to look for, hey, what state is associated with this URL, and if you've specified that ahead of time, you can still navigate to that in the way that you would with V1. It's just that's not. It's more of an under the hood thing that's not driving the logic, other than it's something that's just checked as part of the initial like bootstrapping process of, okay, I'm getting started. Where do I go? And if there is a URL, it's going to check your states to know where to go. If that makes sense.
It does. And is UI router still being used, or is it the NGNU router, or what's its name?
It's Brian Ford put together a pretty awesome router, and so Ionic version 2 right now doesn't completely implement that, but we are going to be implementing that almost in its entirety, I think, but building on top of it, so adding some more Ionic focused features. So it's a bit of a hybrid between the Ionic or the Angular 2 router, along with some of our own goodies added on top of it.
Okay, and another question that I have is, you guys seem to have launched a lot of services over the last year. Could you, and I've missed a lot of them, I think, to be honest with that. Could you give like a high-level overview of what we're able to do now in the cloud with Ionic services?
Right, so there's a number of them, and I should have checked which ones are out lately. But so we've got, maybe this.
Or if you could demo them, some of them.
I don't have a demo really available, but so we've got things like push notifications. We've got a compile process. So for example, if you're a Windows or a PC user, you're not able to build for iOS. So we've got that. So you can upload to Ionic.io, and we can do the compiling for you and give you an application that you're able to submit to things like the iTunes Store. In addition to that, I'm not sure which ones are out yet and which ones are in alpha. We've got analytics that we're working on, and then there's deploy, so that you can. A nice thing is that with hybrid apps, Apple famously has that like 3-day waiting period, or it might be 3 days, it might be however long Apple takes to deploy your app to the App Store. Then kind of a nice thing with hybrid apps is it is not against Apple's terms to update your app on the fly once it's initially improved. It considers HTML and CSS and JavaScript to be assets, not executable code that needs to be reviewed. So you are able to, on the fly, change your app using Ionic services. And probably the thing that is still in early development that I'm probably most excited for is if you combine the analytics service with that live updating service, you're able to do A/B testing, which is the one that I'm most excited about. But we all kind of have our favorites. In addition to the services, we were also rolling out. We're substantially improving Creator, and we're adding. There's always going to be a free tier for individual developers, but we're adding some more enterprisey and business support or features for those groups for Ionic Creator as well.
Cool, thanks.
And that's an important thing to stress, is that for all of our, we are adding these services, and they are paid services, but we are always wanting to offer a free tier for the small and independent developers. That's going to stay.
That's good to hear. Also, could you give any number of the amount of apps that's in the market, or amount of teams that are currently there?
We have no idea. Those are analytics that we don't track, and we can look at Ionic apps, and it's in some ways a testament to Ionic itself. And that one, we're not so evil as to like eat little Easter eggs that phone home and tell us if your app is in the App Store or anything. But also you can't tell if an app is built with Ionic in many cases, and so we can look at things like, oh, I think if there's an icon that's specific to Ionic, we can think, oh, that's an Ionic app. But in many cases, we just have no way of knowing. Yeah.
Cool. And in the market that Ionic launched himself, that allows developers to sell like templates and themes, taken off as well, as expected, or?
What about the market? Oh, the audio is cutting out. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muting it. Sorry. The market that Ionic launched himself, where you allow developers to sell templates and themes and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's my baby actually. So we don't take commission on that. The market isn't a thing for us to make money. If you sell something in the Ionic market, we use a processor called Stripe. So they'll take a little bit of like credit card processing fees, but that's otherwise all the profits go back to you as the developer. And the idea of it is that there's a long list of things of developers will wind up saying like, oh, we should have a calendar picker widget added to Ionic, and there's all these things that Ionic V1 people want from Ionic, but it doesn't really make sense for us to add it. We have to draw the line somewhere as far as how many features we add on and how do we keep the code base lean. But there's still features that are helpful and useful. And so we've opened that up to the community for people to build and share with others, and make a little bit of money on it as well. And that is with plugins, but it's also for full-fledged starters. So if you've got like a good example is there's like there's like a restaurant starter, and so you can purchase that, and then you've got I think that one even comes with like a back end as well that it can phone home and like a little node server or something. And so you've got a full-fledged app that really just needs your own branding and content, and it's ready to go. Lastly, there's also so there's starters, plugins, and then lastly there's themes. And themes are just ways of adding in different kinds of visual styles to Ionic. And so all those three categories are there, and it's very, very active, and there's quite a few things. And yes, you're definitely, as you're getting more excited and confident in Ionic, definitely please put your own stuff up there and make some money at it.
Cool, thanks. Any more questions? No. I guess that's it. I think Hank has a little something.
I will send you a small present. It's very famous Dutch cookies. Can you see this?
I can see the
cookies. Our hometown, David.
Oh my goodness!
I will send it to you. Okay?
Okay. I will send back pictures of the Ionic team enjoying cookies.
Great.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Oh, you guys have a good night.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Right.
Cheers.